Okay, so it looks like everyone has logged on. So welcome to the BikeHike Adventures webinar about adventure travel to Cuba. So we're broadcasting live from Vancouver, Canada. Beautiful Vancouver, Canada, because it's an absolutely gorgeous blue sky day right now, and we're just aching to get back outside and enjoy the sunshine here on Granville Island. And I'm Tracy. I work in the office with Trish, doing some of the marketing and communications. And Trish is sitting next to me here, ready to answer your questions.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for taking time on your Saturdays to listen into this webinar with us. We really appreciate it.
So the way things are going to go a little bit here is we're going to take your questions throughout. You can type them on the side. There's a little area where you can type in your questions and we'll see them. Or alternatively, you can email us at info@bikehike.com, and I'm watching the emails right now. So any emails that come in during the webinar, we'll address those the last 10-ish minutes. But the first part of the presentation, we've got some frequently asked questions that we've lined up to answer for you because we're always getting calls and emails about Cuba right now because it's such a hot topic. And then we've also got a special guest that will be joining us midway through the webinar who was actually in Cuba with Trish this past January. So he'll be adding his insights and offering a little bit about what his experience in Cuba was this past January. So to start off, we're going to sort of dive into talking about the history of bike hike in Cuba. So
hi, everybody. So I started bike hike 21 years ago. So this is our 21st year in operation. And about 15 years ago, I went on my first scouting trip to Cuba, thinking at that time that I wanted to put a trip together in Cuba. It was an interesting trip, and it proved to be challenging to put a trip together in Cuba at that time. So by the time I returned, by looking at the situation with the political landscape at that time and just the challenges of putting a trip together in Cuba at that time, we decided to put it on the back burner. And then I returned again 3 years ago now, and at that point cycled from Havana to Trinidad, and that is actually our program right now. So upon my return from cycling that route, we came back and we put together a Havana to Trinidad cycling route.
And so you've been Bike Hike has actively had a tour in Cuba for the last 3 years.
We have been running 3 years, but it's absolutely taken off in the last year. We had 3 departures in January, we had 3 departures in February, we have 2 departures in March.
And right now we have the cycling-based tour, so cycling Cuba, Havana to Trinidad, but what else do we have in the works?
In the fall, we're planning to add a multi-sport trip that is going to be operating in the western part of Cuba. Right now our trip is in central Cuba, so that'll be a biking and hiking trip, which we don't have all the specifics on that yet, but it is coming in the fall of 2015.
Exciting. Yeah. Exciting times for Cuba and Bike Hike.
Definitely.
So just a reminder that if you want to email your questions in, you can, and we will get to them because there's a lot of questions I know that you guys have. And so we're going to be addressing a good chunk of them in the first part of this webinar. But if we didn't address something that you want to know about, just send us an email at info@bikehike.com or type it into the side of the webinar. And so we've just got pictured here Dennis with Trish on the last trip. He's going to be joining us in a few minutes as well, so stay tuned for that. So we'll get straight into the first question that everyone's been asking about. How is Cuba changing? Because I think you're uniquely qualified to talk about this as well because of the fact that you started going to Cuba 15 years ago. So what have you seen? How is Cuba changing?
One of the biggest changes that's happened in Cuba in the last couple of years is that private enterprise is allowed. So the local people are now able to earn a living from tourism dollars from casa particulares, which are bed and breakfasts, and also from paladars, they're called, which are restaurants. They've always operated in Cuba, but there's many more happening right now. and some of them are fantastic. I must say, they're equivalent to restaurants that you'd find in North America. But one of the other things is that because there is more money coming in through tourism, there always has been money coming in through tourism from the mainstream areas, but now there's more revenue coming in other areas of tourism as well. You'll see more people have cars than they did 15 years ago. So there's still relatively very few cars in Cuba compared to the rest of the world, but I've definitely seen more cars than I did the first time I went to Cuba. On that first trip, I rented it. Well, I had a driver who was driving me throughout Cuba, and I felt really guilty because on the side of the road, you would see 100 to 150 people at different stops along the way, waiting for a pickup truck or something, hitchhiking to get to work. And I felt so guilty being in a car, a single person on a scouting trip. But you still see that. You definitely still see people hitchhiking on the side of the road, but nowhere near to the same extent I did 15 years ago.
Okay, so that brings us to another hot question that people are asking about Cuba. Is Cuba safe? Because people are always asking this, like they're worried that it's some country that is maybe not safe to travel to.
Cuba is one of the safest countries that you can possibly imagine traveling to. There's very, very little crime in Cuba. Saying that, it's still a poor country. So when you're traveling into a poor country, there's always temptation amongst the local people. So I wouldn't be traveling with expensive jewelry and expensive laptops and things like that. It's not really necessary to be bringing those in Cuba. You can't even practically use your laptop there anyway. But also there's a very strong sense of community in Cuba. Everyone helps each other out. Sharing is a very big part of just who the Cuban people are, and they are willing to share the little that they have amongst their community and amongst tourists as well. And they always have a big smile on their faces.
What can you tell the people listening about the sort of overall culture in Cuba? Because there's some surprising things that you'll find when you get to Cuba. And, initially people are worried about safety, but then when they get there, they'll actually find that Cuban culture is
sophisticated.
Yeah, sophisticated is a good word for it.
So it's much more sophisticated than you would imagine it to be. Everybody's really educated. The education standard in Cuba is very high. So you'll meet many doctors, many lawyers, many accountants. They get paid very little money, but they are all highly, highly educated. And overall, I would say it's a very intelligent culture and much more sophisticated than you would imagine it to be.
Okay, so the next thing is, what can people expect? What can foreigners expect in terms of the service industry? So all of those things that people are relying heavily on as a traveler to Cuba, like hotels, restaurants, that sort of thing. What can people expect for the standards in that area?
I would say overall, most of our travelers are extremely satisfied with the hotels. One of the things that all the hotels in Cuba are state-run. Some of them have partnerships with other foreign enterprise, like the Melia Hotel, for example, and those hotels would maybe have more characteristic decor in them. Some of them that are just state-run maybe have a sterile atmosphere, but there's so much colonial architecture in Cuba that it is, all of the hotels that we just stayed in on my last trip, the whole group was very, very pleasantly surprised with everything. However, saying that, you have to set your expectations and understand that Cuba does not have the access to what the rest of the world has because of the embargo. So things may not be some things may be in a state of disrepair. One of my hotels had a lock on the door that was loose. I may have had some leaky faucets. Sometimes hot water is not easy to get because the hot water tanks are small. And if everybody gets in the shower at the same time, you may run out of hot water. There are also casa particulares, and those are bed and breakfasts. And if you're traveling in a small group or traveling just a couple of people, those are also good options for you to stay at, because that really will get you very close to the local people, and you'll stay in their home, dine with them, well, not dine with them, but have breakfast in their family home and really get to know the people. And they vary just as you can imagine people's homes would vary. In terms of meals and things like that, the paladars are the restaurants. And I find the paladars the better places to eat than in the hotels. Many of the hotels have buffets, and they're fairly good, but the paladars tend to have a little bit more variety. And if you are in places like Havana, for example, some of the paladars are very, very good, where you might even find some international cuisine. And I would recommend, if you are spending some extra time in Havana, to take some time and dine in some of those international restaurants, because they're the only places in Cuba you're going to have international cuisine.
Okay, and what about dietary requirements or dietary restrictions? Like, how can a traveler with dietary restrictions expect cuisine in Cuba to be?
So the staple of Cuba is rice and beans. There are not a lot of vegetables in their diet. They do have some vegetables, but it's not a big part of the Cuban diet. A lot of starches. Fruit, eggs, beef, chicken, fish, all very common things that you'll see in the cuisine in Cuba. But if you do have dietary restrictions, vegetarians should be okay, but vegans will have a very difficult time, as gluten-free can have a difficult time as well. So make sure that you bring supplements for yourselves, because you cannot purchase those types of supplements while you're in Cuba.
Okay, so another thing that's really important to talk about, and we get this question all the time, what can we expect what can a traveler expect in terms of money matters in Cuba? So can they use their foreign credit cards? Will they have access to ATMs?
So it depends on where you come from. If you come from anywhere in the world except the US, yes, you can use your credit cards. There are ATM machines in Cuba. For the most part, I did not find one that worked. So don't rely on your ATM card to access your money. In terms of currencies to bring, the best currencies to bring are Canadian dollars, euro, or pounds. American dollars are definitely not advisable to bring to Cuba, because the exchange rate on the American dollar is very low. You'd get the equivalent of what you'd get for the Canadian dollar, which is pretty much 25% off the top right now. And the currency in Cuba is that there are two currencies in Cuba, but for tourists' perspective, the currency that they would be using is called the CUC, the convertible peso. And the convertible peso right now, well, when I was there a couple of weeks ago, on the Canadian dollar was approximately 1.30, which is pretty equivalent to what the US dollar to the Canadian dollar is. I don't know what it is on the other currencies.
And how much money do you tell people to bring on the bike hike trips?
We suggest people bring $500 Canadian with them. Most of the trip includes, most of the things are included on our trip, but this would be for any incidentals. Incidentals being tips to guides, shopping, some alcoholic beverages, because alcohol is not included, departure taxes, and shopping money. But it is always a very good idea, especially for Americans, to bring extra money with them, because again, you cannot use your US credit card. Things are changing, and it's been in the news that American credit cards will be allowed, but not for the average traveler. The places to change money are in, some hotels will allow you to change money. The airport allows you to change money, but the rate can be not great, but I would still do some there, because your hotel may not allow you to do it. if you can go to a bank, but oftentimes the lineups in banks are really long. You could be waiting 2 hours to change money.
Yeah, I think we had a traveler recently tell us about a bank lineup that was that long. So.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so on the topic of money, then another thing that people want to know is Cuba cheap? Like, what are the expenses that people can expect?
So overall, Cuba is not a cheap destination to travel to, and it's really because of the geopolitical situation in Cuba. Nothing can be imported. Well, no, I won't say nothing, but it's very difficult for Cubans to get anything into Cuba, and also it's an island, so their resources are very minimal. So you're paying a premium for that, but saying that, the type of experience that you're getting in Cuba is priceless, especially right now before the changes have occurred. In terms of what costs can foreigners expect in Cuba, well, I guess it's really dependent on whether you're the different ways to travel to Cuba. Cuba are the all-inclusives, which we don't do those, but you won't need a lot of extra money for that. But then you also have the guided trips like we do, and on those trips, the incidentals people can expect to pay for would be tips to guides, shopping, departure taxes, items of personal nature, incidentals. And then if you're traveling to Cuba on your own and nothing is prepared in advance, then you definitely want to have a good supply of cash with you, because you'll be paying for your hotels, you'll be paying for all your meals, your alcohol, any activities you want to participate in, your internal transportation, your departure taxes, and just make sure you have a good cushion of spending money with you.
And in terms of the tipping of a guide, or just tipping in general, what's the tipping culture and expense in Cuba?
So tips are expected in Cuba, and on our trips, for example, we will have, on our Cycling Cuba trip, generally depending on how many people are on the trip, but we will always have a guide, a driver, and oftentimes a mechanic with us as well. And if the group is larger, we might even have a doctor along on the trip. So we generally tell our travelers to, when there's 3 staff on the trip, to leave approximately 50 CUC per traveler, and that will be divided between the guide and the other support staff that's with him.
Okay, perfect. And then another thing that sort of ties into this, and it overlaps a little bit with what people can expect for the accommodation and the service industry, are hotels generally expensive in Cuba?
Pretty much, yeah, hotels are very expensive in Cuba. You could pay, $200 for a 3-star hotel in Cuba, located in the old city. But not only saying that, there's not a large supply of hotels in Cuba, so things sell out pretty far in advance, and especially right now because there's so much demand for Cuba that we're having struggles to find availability in a lot of places.
Another question that people are asking is Cuba Connected? So can foreigners use their cell phones? Can they get internet access? What's it like in terms of connectivity in Cuba?
So it depends on where you come from. If you come from anywhere besides the US, you will get a network on your phone, your mobile phone. So you can use your cell phone to make calls or to text message. It is extremely expensive if you're making calls, however. So you can purchase a text and data roaming package, which many of our travelers do while in Cuba. For American travelers, you will not get a network. So the only option for American travelers is to either bring an unlocked phone to Cuba and purchase a SIM card when you're there, or you can purchase a phone card, and then you'll have minutes on that phone card, and you'll have to make your calls from the hotel telephones. In terms of Wi-Fi, pretty much expect not to be connected, because there is very minimal internet in Cuba. There are a couple of the hotels that we have been to that do have internet, but it's extremely slow. It only works from a specific spot in the lobby, and it is like a dial-up service, so quite painful to use. So I think your best bet is just to think you're going to go to Cuba for a week or 2 weeks, and you're going to be disconnected. Everywhere in the world, wherever you go, you see everybody texting on their phones and things like that. That's not what you see in Cuba anywhere.
That would be
nice.
That would be quite refreshing, actually.
Yes.
So the next thing that people are asking is how easy is it to travel around in Cuba? So for instance, if they were arriving early or staying longer from a trip, or even if someone was just traveling to Cuba on their own, how easy is it to manage those logistics?
It's complicated, and one of the reasons is because of the reliability in Cuba. So there's different ways to get around Cuba. If you're traveling on your own, you can travel by bus, you can rent a car, you can travel by shuttle services where they pick you up at your hotel and drop you off at your hotel, or you can travel by plane. But many of those services, if you book it in advance, either they'll be early or they'll be late or they might not show up. So it's complicated to do that. There are now, since entrepreneurship is available or allowed within Cuba right now, there are some transportation companies that are starting to pop up, which are more reliable. But generally speaking, it's not the easiest place to get around.
So yeah, it's really a destination where booking and organizing in advance is key to having the best possible experience. It's not a spontaneous, on-the-spot, travel around type place.
Absolutely, especially if you have a minimal vacation period of 1 or 2 weeks.
Yeah, you want to make the most of the time that you have and not be waiting for your your taxi to arrive or something like that.
And one of the things with taxis, which I've seen happen, if you have a taxi and you're supposed to meet that taxi at 2 p.m., for example, and the taxi driver arrives at 1:45 and you're not there, even though it's been paid for in advance, he may leave.
So he will get there early, won't see you, and then he'll leave.
Exactly. So you just have to make sure that you're always there with ample time ahead of time to make sure that he doesn't depart before you get there.
Right. So yeah, reliability is one of those issues in Cuba. So you have to have an open mind, and then if possible, have someone else taking care of all those details for you.
Exactly.
Okay, so what is the best time of year to travel to Cuba? This is another question we get a lot. And can a person travel to Cuba all year?
A person can travel to Cuba all year, and travelers do. The optimal time to travel is really from December to March. Although our peak season is November. November is extremely popular for us, but a peak season of Cuba in general is December through February or March, as well as July and August. June, July, August, and September are the hurricane season, and that period tends to be very hot. So if you're doing a cycling trip in Cuba and you're okay with the heat, those months will be okay, but you're looking at temperatures of 35 to 40 degrees Celsius or 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right. So we do, upon request, operate some tours for bike hike during those hotter months, but it's sort of as the requests roll in sort of basis.
Exactly. Our set departures go between October and May, or I believe May. Yes.
And now this is a really hot topic for people and a question that we get a lot. So I haven't ordered these in the order of how many questions or how many times people ask this, and this would probably be at the top of the list. How does one book a flight to Cuba? How does one go about that?
So it really depends on where you're coming from. So anywhere in the world, and I'm going to focus on the North American market, even though we do get travelers from other countries in the world as well, but for this purpose, I'm going to focus on the North American market. So there are flights from Canada on Air Canada Vacations, WestJet Vacations, Sunwing, and Air Transat. And all of those are pretty much charter airlines. So you cannot actually go to the Air Canada website and pull up Air Canada Vacations flights. You actually have to go to Air Canada Vacations. So you can book from any of those places, and they do have flights into Havana and multiple other airports in Cuba, Veradero being one of the most popular because it's a big destination for the all-inclusive resorts. If you're American and you're wanting to travel to Cuba, you can purchase your own flight if you are flying out of Canada, because you're paying a Canadian company to be purchasing a flight from Canada. And then what you would have to do is book a separate flight from your home city to one of those Canadian cities, example Toronto, and then other areas you could do that from are Mexico, Mexico City. Aeromexico operates a flight out of Mexico City into Havana as well. There are a few other countries as well, Nassau, Grand Cayman Islands. However, the companies that actually own the systems that book the flights, many of those companies are American companies, so the flights will not even show up in their system. Example, Travelocity, Expedia, Kayak, or the systems of the travel agents, which are called Apollo. So we work with a consolidator who is able to book flights to Cuba on Aeromexico because they actually have a relationship with Aeromexico. Plus, we have had some horror stories from some of the other carriers that are flying into Cuba from some of those other destinations that I've mentioned, where, again, it's all about the reliability. And flights have been canceled at the very last minute, same day of the trip. So travelers were not able to actually make it on their trips. And just one last point on all this. It's extremely important that you purchase or your first flight into those cities, Toronto or Mexico, you give yourself a really good cushion of travel time, because if you do have a delay, a mechanical issue, a weather issue that causes you to miss your second flight into Havana, your two tickets are not connected and you could lose your flight from your secondary city, Toronto. It just happened to one of our travelers who just gave herself 3 hours in between the two flights. And 3 hours, just so you're aware, is so minimal because you actually have to exit the airport, go through customs, you have to collect your luggage, and then you have to get to the next terminal of where might be a different terminal in the airport to where you're checking in for your second flight and be there 2 hours before your international flight. So we really suggest travelers overnight in that secondary city, just in case of a delay, because you could lose your whole ticket.
Yeah, definitely. So you have to bear that in mind when you're putting those two tickets together. The next thing that is a really important topic to cover is insurance in Cuba, and we get this question a lot. Is it actually mandatory to have insurance to travel to Cuba?
It is mandatory for every single traveler that they have to have medical coverage to enter Cuba, and that medical coverage, you may be asked upon arrival into Cuba by the customs officer to show proof of your medical coverage. So international travelers are able to purchase travel insurance in their home countries, or perhaps use their medical plans that they have in their home countries for travel, as long as it extends internationally into Cuba. American travelers, unfortunately, do not have that option. So American travelers have to purchase a medical insurance plan through the provider that they are traveling to Cuba with, and there's a per day cost for those. Which actually leads me to another question about insurance, which is cancellation insurance. Any American traveler who is not traveling on a specific license into Cuba cannot purchase cancellation insurance. So that's something they definitely must keep in mind.
So basically you're not covered in the same way you would be as if you were going to other destinations.
Exactly.
For obvious reasons, I guess. So is there an actual visa required for travel to Cuba for foreigners, and how does one get that?
So it's called a tourist card, and every traveler has to have that upon entering Cuba. So it depends on how you're getting there. Some of the Canadian carriers include it in their trip cost. So the flight attendant will actually give you the tourist card on the plane. Some destinations, like Aeromexico, if you're flying out of Mexico City, there will be a ticket booth in the Mexico airport where you'll have to purchase that tourist card. You cannot make a mistake on the form. It has two sides, one for arrival, one for departure. And if you do make a mistake on that form, you will have to purchase another one for $30 US. And you might have to make sure that you keep your return portion with your passport. If you lose it, you'll have to purchase another one as well. Any American traveler who is going to Cuba should check with the air carrier that they're traveling with if they will receive one of those tourist cards on the plane, or if they have to apply for it separately.
Okay, so now are you ready for the next question? The next question is what everyone wants to know. Trish, can you tell us, can Americans travel to Cuba?
As you can imagine, and as you are probably hearing, things are changing rapidly, but at present, it is still not legal for the average American tourist to travel to Cuba unless they are qualified in one of 12 different categories.
And it's kind of one of those technicalities because Americans are welcomed by Cubans in Cuba. So there's no illegality to it in Cuba. The illegal nature of it is in the exiting of U.S. to enter as American into Cuba,
Exactly.
basically.
And we've put a slide up on our screen here. It's the Embassy of Switzerland in Washington, D.C., and you can get the most updated information from this embassy because there's so much ambiguity at the moment, and everything is changing so rapidly that we honestly cannot keep up with it just as much as everybody else can keep up with it. So this would be your best resource right now.
Yeah, definitely. So you can call through to that number at the Embassy of Switzerland. So it's a Cuba interest section is actually sort of operating like an embassy, but it's an unofficial embassy within the Swiss embassy. So the number is up on the screen. And if you're just listening to this, the number is 202-797-8518. And you can also Google Cuba interest section, Embassy of Switzerland, and you'll get that information.
Contact them directly for the most updated information because there's so much change going on with the relations between the U.S. and Cuba at the moment.
Okay, so the next section here is where we're going to sort of bring Dennis into the conversation a little bit. So, and again, if you have any questions that you want to email into us, that you want us to answer in the last part, just send us an email at info@BikeHike or put it into the side screen. So the next, and so some of these questions, so there's additional frequently asked questions that we haven't covered yet, but they'll sort of be tied into the conversation that we'll be having with Dennis. So the first thing that we get asked a lot, and it relates a little bit more to adventure travel and cycling tours in Cuba. What are the road conditions, or the road and biking conditions in Cuba? So you can start that, Trish, and then if you have something to add in, Dennis, you can sort of come into this conversation.
So relatively speaking, the biking conditions are fantastic. There are so few vehicles on the roads. The roads are paved, but saying that, there are definitely lots of potholes on the road. You get lots of horse and carriages going down the roads, so there's lots of interaction with local people along the way. But relatively speaking, the roads for Cuba for cyclists are fantastic.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Trish. I was impressed with and surprised as to how good the roads were. And also with the lack of traffic, you just felt safe, even if you had to avoid a pothole here and there. And so, yeah, the roads were not an issue at all.
And the vehicles that are there, they definitely don't drive fast. So.
And in terms of the biking What can you say about the bikes in Cuba?
So our bikes, it's not easy to get bikes into Cuba. All of our bikes have come from the UK, and we've had travelers who have actually brought the bikes to Cuba for us. So the bikes that we supply are Trek and Specialized with semi-slick tires. We always recommend people bring their own bike seat and pedals and shoes if you want to ride clipless. But relatively speaking, the bikes were great. But if you're just going to Cuba on your own and you're hoping to rent a bike, it's not going to be easy to find a bike in Cuba. So you pretty much probably have to bring your own. Same thing goes with parts, because you can't buy bike parts in Cuba very easily. So you'll definitely need to come prepared with everything you need. Dennis?
Yeah, I thought the bikes were in good condition. I think they were, like you mentioned, the Trek 2400s or what have you. So as opposed to even road bikes on the highways, the mountain bikes were appropriate for hill climbing and for the speed we were going. So the bike mechanic that was along would deal with any adjustments that were needed, and so it kept us going. It went really well as far as the bikes that were used.
And actually that leads me to another question that a lot of people ask in terms of what are the roads like. Cuba's not, I wouldn't call it mountainous, I would call it hilly with undulating climbs. Nothing is too hard at all. It's not like traveling Costa Rica, which I see some people on here who have traveled with us in Costa Rica, where everything is a big, big climb. It would be more undulating, gentle climbs. What do you think, Dennis, on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we did the Costa Rica coast-to-coast trip with BikeHike a couple of years ago, and that was definitely more of a challenge in terms of the hills. And so this was still a challenge, but more like you said, a hilly type of surroundings.
Okay, so the next sort of thing that people are wondering a lot about in terms of adventure travel in Cuba, they're wondering what the possibilities for cultural interaction are on trips to Cuba compared to other places.
There are so many cultural interactions that can happen on a cycling trip. And here in this current slide that's on there right now, there's horse and carriage that go down the streets constantly with ox. This is an ox cart going down the street. So I personally love stopping on cycling trips and interacting with the kids and the locals along the way. In fact, there was one time on this trip with Dennis. Dennis, you weren't there at that moment, but we saw some people digging a well, and we got off of our bikes and we went to see what they were doing. And we looked down at the bottom of the well, and there was a guy having lunch at the bottom of the well. And we thought, oh, that's an interesting place to be having lunch. And the local people were giggling with us, and they were so happy that we'd stopped and had a chance to chat with them, and invited us to have, next time we came back to Cuba, they would have fresh water for us to drink. They'd be able to offer us a glass of water. But there are many, a lot of people cycle in Cuba as well, again, because there's not a lot of cars. So if you have an open personality and you just want to meet people while you're there, the local people love it. They always have a big smile on their faces, and they love to get their photos taken.
Yeah, so we have a slide here where there's a couple kids on the school kids on the side of the road looking at photos on an iPhone, it looks like. Dennis, what can you add to what were some of the cultural interaction experiences that you had, and maybe some highlights?
Yeah, I thought we had great opportunity, and sometimes I think it was just spontaneous, and we came across a situation, we're able to interact like children waiting for a bus to go to school, and we'd be able to take their photos and show them like you had indicated. Other times I thought it was part of the plan where the guides had arranged. For instance, there was one time where we were able to stop for a coffee break at a family farm and interact with the family, and we gave coloring books to the kids there, and so I had a nice chance to visit with them. Another time I remember we were in Trinidad and walking around one morning, and my wife saw an older gentleman selling some bananas, and so she went to ask him about the bananas, and he was ready to just give them to us. Even though he was selling them, he saw that we were tourists, he was ready to just give them to him. So I certainly understand what Trish was mentioning earlier, that they're so generous. The people there believe in sharing. We did get the bananas and we did pay for them, but I mean, just the interaction with the people. You know, lunch breaks, we would usually stop. I remember one time we stopped at an organic farm, pottery making place, and had an opportunity to do a little bit of a tour there. So yeah, that was really a highlight, being able to interact with the people there.
Very well. It's very well said, Dennis. It's so true, those types of interactions.
What about in terms of the destination route that you chose from Havana to Trinidad? Why is it that you particularly wanted to focus on that route for you?
There's really 3 different cycling routes that are the main routes that we would do, or people would basically do for cycling through Cuba. And one of them is Western Cuba, one of them is Central Cuba, and one of them is Eastern Cuba. Central, like Havana, all the way to the east. That is a 2-week trip, which is generally too long for most of our travelers. So Trinidad is a pretty special city. It's just one of the nicest cities of Cuba, besides Havana, and it's a good distance. It's approximately 400 kilometers from Havana to Trinidad. Western Cuba is another area of Cuba, which is fantastic. We are starting another trip there in the fall, which will be a multi-sport adventure. We customize trips all the time, so we actually customized a trip for Dennis and his group, and we worked with him on some of his specific needs of where he wanted to get to in that itinerary, which is how we came up with that itinerary. But a lot of it was very similar to the Central Cuba trip that we generally do on our Cycling Cuba trip.
And how would you compare the kind of cultural experiences that people can have on this, like on a trip to Cuba, to cultural experiences that they could have in another country? Like, let's even say Costa Rica, because Dennis is on the line and he's most recently experienced Costa Rica with Bike Hike.
Costa Rica, for me, is not a country that you experience the culture like you do in Cuba. There's many destinations that are very, very culturally rich, and Cuba is definitely one of those. Especially, it's such a colorful country. People don't wear black and gray and brown in Cuba. They wear hot pink and turquoise and bright red, and just colors that are vibrant, which is they're all very musical. They're all very boisterous. One of the things about Cuba, which is kind of going back to the hotel question, everything is loud in Cuba. And it's because they're a loud culture. They love to dress nice. They love to dance. They love to sing. They're full of music and art, and they're all in the streets having fun. And you'll get a chance to actually encounter that throughout the country a lot, which Costa Rica would be different, because Costa Rica is about the rainforest, the cloud forest, the dry forest. But there are many of the destinations we do that are very culturally rich, and Cuba comes very high in that category.
Yeah, and it's so unique, and there's no other place in the world like Cuba, partly because of the political situation and the embargo. But I mean, to see, it's almost like you're frozen in time, or you get a view on something that's frozen in time, with the 50s American vehicles that are there sharing the highways with a horse and buggies, and then possibly an Audi that drives by. And so it's so unique, an experience from that perspective.
It's also the architecture as well, because there's, in some of the big cities, Havana, again, Trinidad, it's colonial architecture with pastel-colored buildings, crumbling walls, and cobblestone streets. So there's so much.
Dennis, I know that at the end of your trip to Cuba, or at the end of your bike hike portion of the trip, you spent some time at a resort in Cuba. So how would you compare the experience you had culturally while you were in the resort area of Cuba versus when you were experiencing Cuba through bike hike?
Well, that's an interesting question because Bunny and I were just talking about that this week, comparing the 2 weeks that we had in Cuba. And both of us feel, I mean, the first week when we did the cycling was so much more of a rich experience. And in fact, one thing that I thought was interesting is even the food that we had during that week was far superior to the food we had at the 4.5-star resort on the beach that we stayed at the second week. And of course, we were talking how if we would have just flown in, gone to the beach, and spent a week there, I mean, it would have been nice and everything else, but so much more rewarding to have the cultural experience and being able to, in a sense, we felt like we were able to experience Cuba in slow motion on a bike because we could slow right down, take a look at the buildings, take a look at the people and what they were doing, whether they were farming or what have you, stop and take pictures, interact with them, and move on. And so, really, there was no comparison in the 2 weeks. We certainly preferred the first week when we were cycling.
And why did you pick Cuba as a cycling destination for this group? I know that you were raising money for a charity organization that was working with some hospitals, but what appealed to you about Cuba? Why did you choose Cuba?
Well, like you indicated, one of our participants had previously volunteered in Cuba at a hospital there, and so that was a connecting point. And after we did the Costa Rica trip 2 years ago, we thought, well, where would we go next? And the fascination about what we'd heard about Cuba, the uniqueness of it was there, but we also, with us wanting to raise funds and do this trip with a purpose, thought we had, or at least one participant that had come along with us had connections with the hospital and that type of thing, so we figured it was just a good fit for us this time around.
Great. So is there anything else that you can think of about your experience in Cuba that you'd want to add to anyone listening who's maybe thinking about organizing a trip for themselves to Cuba?
Well, the only thing I'd add is just to confirm what Trish had indicated, we felt safe there. We felt that the people were friendly. The accommodations were better than we expected. They're clean and comfortable. And so, yeah, the experience was over the top amazing, and certainly I would highly recommend it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for helping us
Dennis.
Sort of paint a picture of Cuba. So I think you're going to stay on the line a little bit longer here, but we're just going to move on to a couple of Trish's more specific highlights, and then we're going to answer any questions that people have emailed in. There's a couple that have come in over email. So Trish, so thanks again, Dennis. That was
you're welcome.
I have you with us.
Thank you so much. So I would say one of my big highlights of this trip was really traveling on a trip like this with Dennis, where it was a trip with a purpose, and they raised a lot of money for this hospital in Cuba, and we got a chance to go into that hospital and actually see where their dollars were going. And it was so rewarding to be there and meet the people who were involved with that. For me, it was just really brought it close to my heart to actually see, this in action, because they really have very little over there. And that was just extremely, extremely special. And also, just another highlight for me, I love places that are culturally rich. It's just my thing. And I love wandering through the cities with my camera, just taking candid shots of people. And they love that. They're just so open to interacting with you. And for me, that was really, really special.
So when you spend your time in Havana and Trinidad, I know we've talked a lot about this in the office, so maybe you can tell people a little bit about how how do you spend your time, your free time in Havana and Trinidad? Like, what's your favorite thing to do, or your favorite place to be in those cities?
I just walk and walk and walk and sit at cafes for a cerveza, and like I just said, take photos of people, and you stumble upon so many things. Oddly enough, I was twice when I was in Cuba. I actually saw fires while I was in Cuba. It was very bizarre to see a fire in Cuba, but it was just interesting to see how a local community, the fire department, responded to that, because somebody on our trip actually asked one of the guides, "Are there firefighters in Cuba?" And he was like, "Are you kidding me? Of course there are." So it was interesting to see how they reacted to that. But there's many markets. As I mentioned before, Cubans are amazing when it comes to artisans. So there's so much to buy, and I love to shop. So I spend a lot of time wandering around through some of those markets and just people watching. If one of your interests is photography, honestly, Cuba is an incredible place for photography because of the pastel colors and the light.
And is there any particular recommendations you can give people in terms of shopping? Because you love to shop, and and as the people on Trish's most recent trip in Cuba can attest to you scurrying into shops and markets to pick things up. Leave you 5 minutes, and what kind of damage can you do in a shop?
So what Tracy's alluding to here is that we had a total of a half hour in the town of Trinidad, and I really, really wanted to get these wooden figures for our office, and they're big. They're probably standing 4 feet high, and I purchased in a matter of 15 minutes 2 massive wooden statues for our office. We've given them the names Mimi and Momo, and they were so heavy that I didn't think I'd be able to get them home, but I did. But that's just one of the things that's in Cuba. So art, paintings are fantastic, paper mache, wooden figures, all sorts of things that they make from recycled things. Cuba is definitely not a throwaway society, because it's just not possible to have that in Cuba. So they recycle everything, and some of the art that they make out of Coke cans or used tires or whatever, used whatever, shoes. It's amazing pieces of art that they've made.
Okay, so the last sort of 10 minutes-ish we have here, we just wanted to answer a few of the questions that have popped up. And so if you have any questions, again, you can just email them to info@bikehike. Even right now, we'll still be able to answer them. So the questions that have popped up, one of them is whether or not you can rent a bike on your own in Cuba. Like, how easy is it to rent a bike on your own, or to rent, a scooter or something like that? Is that even possible?
We do get requests from people asking if we can do self-guided for them so that they can bring their own bikes to Cuba, but we don't rent bikes. We only have enough bikes for our trips, and I don't know of anyone else in Cuba who does rent bikes. It may be there, but I don't know of it.
Okay, another question that came up that we didn't mention in the frequently asked questions at the beginning, but it actually is a little bit of a frequently asked question, and it's about the electricity in Cuba. So how is it plugs and things like that?
It's the same as the North American electrical 2-prong, square prong, and the voltage is either 110 or 220.
Okay. And so another question is related to medical. Like, if someone gets sick or has prescription medication that they need to get while they're there, what are the possibilities around that? Like, how easy is it to get?
Virtually impossible. If you have anything like that you need to bring to Cuba, that is mandatory that you have while you're in Cuba, you make sure you bring that up ahead of time. The same thing would go for anything that you particularly wanted, like for example, for a biking trip, if you wanted energy bars or electrolytes or things like that, it's just not possible to buy that in Cuba. So you have to make sure that you bring anything like that on your own. I actually have a photo of a drugstore in Cuba which has barely anything on the shelves. So one of the things that our group did is bring a lot of medicine and prescription drugs and things like that to Cuba.
Okay. Another question that came up is how possible, or is it possible for someone to arrange hotel bookings on their own in, Havana and Trinidad? Because I guess maybe they had difficulties trying to organize something on their own. So
it is definitely possible for people to do that on their own, but keep in mind that Cuba is very, very popular right now, and even we are having a very difficult time finding availability in some of the hotels. So you definitely need to plan ahead of time if you're looking to book your own. It is the peak season right now, like I mentioned earlier on, our peak season is November, but between November, December, January, February, March, peak season, as well as July and August, so it's very difficult to find availability. Even in some of those resort towns like Veradero, it can be difficult to find availability.
Okay. And another one that actually we probably should have included earlier but didn't is, does a person need to be able to speak some Spanish to get around Cuba, or?
If you're traveling on Cuba on your own, I would say it would definitely be helpful to have some Spanish for sure. Depending on if you're traveling in Veradero, then you don't really need to have Spanish. One of the mainstream resort areas, because the local people will. But if you're traveling throughout the country, for example, biking on your own or traveling throughout the country with a rental car or something of that sort, you will not encounter a lot of people who do speak English because they've just not been exposed to enough of English-speaking people. So.
Okay. So we actually also had a question about whether or not you have any recommendations for things to do if a person were extending their time in Cuba. So before or after, places that they could go, areas of Cuba that they could see that weren't part of a scheduled tour like the Bike Hike Cycling Cuba, Central Cuba trip.
So as I mentioned earlier, there's 3 main areas of Cuba. I'm not talking about the resort towns. Some people, like Dennis's group, enjoy to add on a week on a beach in one of the resort towns, and that's definitely a good idea if you want to spend some time on a beach. But if you're looking for something more cultural, then Pinar del Rio area, which is Western Cuba, is definitely a beautiful area to spend some of your time. Viñales, Cayo La Visa is a small island in Western Cuba, which is known to have some of the best snorkeling in all of Cuba. And the eastern part of Cuba is also very, very popular. I've unfortunately not been there yet, but it's meant to be absolutely spectacular and very culturally rich as well. But again, that takes a little bit more time. But that actually leads me to another one of the questions about travel within Cuba. If you are planning to do a trip like that, where you're planning to go to eastern Cuba, one of the best ways to get there could be by flight because buses are so not reliable. So you might want to fly there are quite a few airports within Cuba that you can catch flights to some of these areas.
Okay, another question that kind of ties in with the health insurance, but I don't know if we really covered this, I guess, was what is the healthcare like in Cuba? So if something happens in Cuba, what can a person expect in terms of healthcare?
There are many trained doctors in Cuba, so that level of having the care of a doctor will be very high. However, the hospitals themselves in Cuba are a very low standard, and again, they don't have the supplies or the facilities that you would have at home. So in terms of getting the care from the doctor, things will be good, but from the hospital itself, it will not.
Okay, and another sort of frequently asked question that we've been reminded of is related to things that you could take back from Cuba. Like, what could you buy in Cuba and take home, and what are there some restrictions about that sort of thing?
There are definitely, one of the things that everybody wants to bring home with them are Cuban cigars or Cuban rum. We have heard from some of our travelers that if they are questioned at all, one of the things they are questioned about is, do you have any cigars or rum? And they don't say specifically Cuban, but they might say that. But other than that, it would be art. I would say art would be one of the best things to bring back from Cuba, definitely.
Okay, and so we just have time for one last question here. And that is, let me just look what's one quickly that we can answer here. Is there anything, any kind of diseases or anything like that, like any health worries to have going to Cuba?
So we're not physicians here, so we're not qualified to give that type of information. So for on all of our trips, we always refer people to check with the Center for Disease Control website. Their website is cdc.gov, and they do keep an updated website of the entire world and any outbreaks that have come out anywhere in the world. So that will be your best resource in that regard.
Okay, so I think our time is sort of winding down here as far as what we could feasibly answer in 1 hour. So thank you for tuning in to the webinar. And if you had any questions that we didn't get to, still you can email us at info@bikehike.com.
Or call us.
888-805-0061. And thanks again, Dennis. I think you're still on the line here. So thanks again for joining us and helping us with this webinar.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm glad that you asked me.
Thanks, Dennis.
All right, so we hope to hear from any of you listening through email or phone calls, or if you're any time near Vancouver or Granville Island, pop in and say hello, and we'd love to answer more of your Cuba questions or talk to you about adventure travel.
Thank you, everybody, and have a great weekend.